Hey, what's up guys? So we finally got a sole leader in the 2020 candidates with Jan Nepomniachtchi defeating Wang Hao today and taking the lead. All three other games finished in a draw. We had Anish Giri, who actually blew a pretty serious advantage against Fabiano Caruana. He was very close to winning that game, but ultimately Fabi put up a very tough defense. MVL and Alexienko drew in a pretty sharp and theoretical Najdorf, and Grischuk drew with Ding Liren and then created some controversy after the round with his comments about how he believes the tournament should not currently be held given the worldwide situation with the pandemic, and that it should ultimately just be postponed until later. But we'll get into all of that after today's round. Jan is the individual leader, MVL is in clear second place with 3 points, and then we have Fabi, Wang Hao, and Grischuk well within striking distance, just 1 point behind the leader. So going to the first and only decisive game of the round, here Wang Hao played his usual Petrov defense. This is kind of known as a Chinese specialty. A lot of Chinese players include this opening as part of their repertoire. And Nepo chooses one of the more theoretical lines as of late. Of course, the other big main line in this position after knight takes e4 is to go knight to c3 with a very, very wide body of theory. But he goes for the older main line with d4, d5, and introduced a pretty interesting novelty on move 13. We end up getting this position that greatly resembles an exchange French, where white can fight for a little bit more of an advantage than normal due to the small lead in development, and with black's knight on d6 not at its usual spot on f6, where it does a better job of covering the king side. Here c6 is played, bishop f4, knight a6. This is all part of the mainline theory. And here comes a new move, h4. Now this move is of course becoming super thematic nowadays. Players are trying this in almost every line, every position, so I can't imagine this was too surprising of a move to see, but it does pose some pretty serious practical problems for black, as was kind of shown in this game. Previously Vishy Anand played knight e3 against Yu Yangyi, and that game ended in a draw, but this h4 move I found actually extremely interesting. Now of course the pawn cannot be taken, as after knight h4, queen h4, this knight on d6 will be hanging. Instead, black played the move knight to c7, and now comes white's idea to play knight to g5, and posing a pretty serious question for black. Either black has to give up the dark squared bishop by taking, or has to play a somewhat weakening move g6. Wang Hao decided to grab on g5, but it would have been interesting to see what exactly he had in mind, what white had in mind against this move g6, maybe knight e3 here or knight g3, followed by trying to one day play h5 and putting pressure on the g6 pawn. Instead, black took on g5, bishop takes g5, and here Nepo kind of said something strange in the press conference. He said this move f6 is kind of dubious, or maybe he meant that taking on g5 is not right, because at this point actually black doesn't really have a choice other than to play f6. If queen d7, white comes in with rook e7, then plays queen to g3, and just has a pretty serious advantage here. So this one would certainly be much tougher for black compared to the game. Instead, f6 was played, bishop f4, queen d7, knight to g3, and now white's idea is to essentially take on d6 at some point, bring his knight to f5, and this knight on f5 is going to be really strong. Now the engine doesn't give white a huge edge here, but he does get a very pleasant position for queen h3, threatening knight h6 check, king h8, h5, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, rook to e8 was played. Nepo goes ahead and trades rooks, and we get this position with queen and knight versus queen and knight, but white has more space, and black actually has these kind of long-term back rank problems. He doesn't really want to play the move h6 here. This will just invite a future knight h4, knight to g6, when again the king will be suffering a little bit, and it's also very difficult for black to play g6 as well to give the king any space. Here white played g4, really ambitious move, posing some problems to black, and the point was that if black went back here with king to g8, white could then continue to push with g5, once again threatening the move knight h6 check. Black would have to move the king again, something like king h8, and then white can continue with g6 and posing some real pressure on the king side. Instead, Wang Hao just kind of starts to wait here with a6, White plays b3, starting to push a little bit on the queen side. After the game, Nepo suggested the move king to f1, which is quite an interesting choice. Basically a prophylactic move against black's ideas of playing queen to e6 and trying to create any counterplay. And from here, white's idea would be to try to infiltrate with a move like queen to h2 and trying to come in to b8. Now, for the most part, Wang Hao defended well here. The critical moment took place near the time control. We saw h6, fixing the back rank issues for black. c4, a nice move. Black cannot really take this pawn on c4. After knight c4, queen takes c4, and queen h2, we kind of see the whole point of white's play here. The queen is starting to come in with queen to b8, and even if black gets out with king to g8, white is still giving this check and taking this pawn, followed by taking the pawn on h7, where black's queen is not going to be able to create a perpetual check in time, and white is just going to have a winning h6 pawn. So this c4 pawn was definitely poisoned. Black tried king to g8, queen h2 was played, king f7, c5, knight b5, and queen b8. This was kind of the critical moment where Wang Hao ends up making a losing move, queen to d7. The engine points out knight takes d4 here, but this, in order to play this for black, you would have to allow queen takes b7 and then queen takes a6, grabbing a lot of pawns. Where after queen e4, it turns out black makes enough counterplay to survive here, but of course this is easy for an engine to calculate, much more difficult for a human to figure out over the board, even one of the strongest players in the world. Instead, Wang Hao makes a huge mistake here with queen to d7. Queen h8 was played, king to e6, and now fantastic move f4. Really just putting a lot of pressure against the king, threatening to play f5 check soon, where black's king is really going to be under serious pressure. Wang Hao grabs his pawn on d4. Nepo repeats once, queen c8, queen g8, queen f7, and now very strong move, queen to d8, which was missed by Wang Hao, as he admitted after the game. The point is that white is attacking this knight on d4, as well as threatening a potential f5 check, which leaves black's king in serious danger. If knight b5, for example, white first starts with queen c8 check, queen d7 is forced, and now after f5, black has to take. Otherwise, if king e7, white will trade queens, take on g6, and win with the h-pawn. Instead, after g takes f5, g takes f5, king has to go back to e7 to cover the queen, and now after queen h8, black is just lost, as white is going to be taking this one soon, and again, the h-pawn decides the game. Instead, after queen d8, Wang Hao tried queen to d7 here, but this is not such a great attempt. After f5, black is forced to essentially just lose a piece, as the king cannot stay in touch with the queen, has to play knight takes f5, and after queen takes d7, king takes d7, knight takes f5, white is just a piece up in this endgame for 2 pawns, but black doesn't have nearly enough counterplay and resigned after king e6, knight to e3, where the king is not able to cross over and try to take this one, and white will be able to secure the h6 pawn. For instance, after knight e3, king f7, king f2, king g6, knight to g4, f5, knight e3. White is ready to take the f5 pawn, and if we trade these guys, then the knight will simply run to d6, start picking up black's queenside, and simply win the game. And after f4, knight g4, king g5, king f3, black could easily just resign here, as the h6 pawn is going to stay on the board. So Nepo wins this one. I think so far he's really been showing fantastic form. His win against Anish Giri in the first round was very technical and impressive, and his play in the rounds between them has also been quite good, saving some tough positions against Caruana and Grischuk as well. Moving on to our next game, Anish Giri versus Fabiano Caruana. Once again, Fabi chooses the Slav, the same opening he chose against Ding Liren in that kind of infamous game now that he ended up losing despite really good preparation. So it seems like the Slav is something that Fabi has prepared for the tournament. It wasn't just a one-game surprise, but it is something that he's going to be playing consistently here. And Giri plays this a slow Slav, the e3 system, in quite an interesting way. He goes for bishop d2 here. Bishop e7, takes, and queen to c2. This is a setup I have a little bit of experience with, where white is actually going to be castling queenside, and I think this is actually a pretty sharp approach of dealing with this position. And Fabi actually ends up getting into trouble pretty quickly. After castles knight b6, he induces white to play c5, drops back in order to get the b6 break in. king b1, queen to b8. This move was somewhat criticized by Giri afterwards due to his response h4. Now the engine thinks that black would actually have pretty good compensation here after b6, but Fabi chose a different approach. He goes for g5, which ultimately just doesn't end up so good. White plays bishop to e1, and the problem is that eventually the king side is going to start opening up, and white's two bishops, although currently they're both on the back rank, are eventually going to be quite strong here. So g4 was played, white pushes e4, takes space in the center. Anish after the game suggested bishop e2. I think in both cases white gets a pretty sizable edge here. Instead e4 happens, takes b6, e takes d5, e takes d5, takes on b6, a takes b6, and now knight to e2. Queen a7, b3, knight h5, knight g3, and even though white's structure here is kind of wrecked, black's king doesn't have such a clear safety net in this position. Of course c6 here has never been hanging due to the a2 pawn. G6 was played, takes, and now f4. So Anish really played this part of the game well. He's ready to go bishop to e2, push black's rook back, and then he's going to be pushing either h5 or f5 and just opening up the entire position on the light squares. And he ended up getting a very big advantage here after bishop to c3, takes on d4, bishop f6. This is kind of the only way black could try and stabilize the position, but it's really not enough. Despite trading off one of white's bishops, after f5 it's black's king side that's opening up. The a2 pawn is nice and secure, and the bishop is certainly stronger than the knight in this situation, especially with the f-file soon opening up and white getting a ton of counterplay. Now here after g takes f5, bishop takes f5, Fabiano finds a pretty strong idea here with the move b5, and for the full analysis of this one, I would encourage you guys to check out Jesse's Move of the Day video, where he kind of goes over Fabi's very good defense in this game, where his position here is objectively bad, basically lost, but he's able to hold on with some tricky defensive maneuvers. I think the engine was suggesting a move like queen to b2 here, which is quite logical to put the queen on this long diagonal, followed by rook h5, for instance, rook to f1, just holding on to the bishop. Once again, this knight is not hanging because of the a2 pawn. White does have to cover this one, but white is ready to start creating a lot of threats along the f-file. Instead, Anish played rook h2, rook h5, rook e2, and now after d4 and rook to e5, Fabi finds a fantastic resource here with knight to g4. Rook c5 is played, knight to e3, rook c8, this is all forced. Takes, king e7, rook to c1, and Giri admitted that he had missed black's response here, the move knight to d5, where almost by a miracle, black is actually surviving this one. White has no good ideas here, and the players actually repeated very quickly after rook e1 check, knight e3, rook c1, knight d5, again covering this key c7 square, and due to the threat of potential move knight to c3, white is not really able to do a whole lot here. After the game, I was thinking maybe king a1 would be a try, where if black puts knight on c3, then white will go rook e1 check, and this is a disaster for black's king. Black would have to find this only move d3. I'm sure Fabiano would manage, he's a very strong player, threatening queen to d4 check. Here after rook to e1, knight e3, queen d7 is a way to kind of equalize, otherwise white is actually going to be ending up worse here, and the game would likely reach a drawn endgame after black gives back the queen, and we reach some situation like this that would be pretty drawish. So definitely a missed opportunity for Giri there, but ultimately a successful game. His preparation was very good, and he did outplay the strongest player in the event, but I'm sure he's going to be kicking himself a little bit for not converting this one. Moving on to the next game between Kirill Aleksenko and MVL. Here MVL sticks to his usual Najdorf, and Kirill chooses a very sharp line, the English attack. Now black has different ways of playing against this one. A lot of players prefer to put the pawn on e5. MVL chooses a sharper approach with e6. And here white chooses the move 9a3, which is very trendy, very topical. Of course, the big main lines here are the moves g4 and castles queenside. Usually white ends up making both of these moves. Starting with a3 is kind of a flexible choice, prevents black from pushing b4, and waiting to see what black is going to do here. This was also the choice of Magnus Carlsen in his 2019 game against MVL in London in the Grand Chess Tour. I believe that was a rapid game, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong on that, because MVL actually ended up winning that game with black against Magnus. Magnus doesn't lose with white very often, and the players followed this game for quite some time here. After the moves knight b6, queen e1, knight d7, g4, takes, and here g6. Previously, MVL played bishop f8 against Magnus, but engines show that this move is not very good. Strong for white is bishop to g5, queen c7, and then rook to h4. After rook takes h4, queen takes h4, white's queen is going to be extremely active here, heading to h8. So instead, MVL comes up with an improvement here, plays the move g6, and after a little bit of thought, Aleksenko goes ahead and plays rook takes g6, which is of course the engine's top choice, indicating that he had kind of seen this position before. MVL responds with his own sacrifice, rook takes c3. Real quick, the point after fg6, knight takes e6, is that black's queen is simply trapped. So black goes rook takes c3 first in order to create a square for the queen. And here in this position, Aleksenko spent a good 48 minutes. After the game, he admitted that although he knew that the move was rook takes g6, or that this was the computer's suggestion, he did not know really many details after this point and was basically trying to work it out for himself. Of course, such a sharp position, there is a ton to calculate here. Now, technically, white could force a draw here with the move queen takes c3. Black's idea would be to play knight to a4 in order to create some counterplay. Then white can play queen b3, for example. And I don't believe black is anything better than f takes g6, knight takes e6, queen to c8, or queen to b8. And here white can repeat moves with knight g7 check, followed by knight to e6 back. And neither side can really play on. The position is extremely sharp. Instead, Aleksenko chooses the move knight takes e6 here, just throwing even more fuel on the board. Black plays queen to c8. After f takes e6, then of course the rook would be safe. White could play queen takes c3 with a huge advantage here. So queen c8, knight g7, king f8, and rook to h6. Very accurate move. The knight on g7 cannot be taken, as after queen to g1 check, the rook on h6 is defended, and white is actually going to be giving a quick mate here. Instead, black plays rook takes h6, bishop takes h6, rook takes c2. I believe this position was still part of MVL's preparation, as he was explaining in the post-game press conference. And objectively, things are very close to equal, and as it often happens in these super sharp positions, I mean, white is down a piece, but the complications just kind of peter out into a draw. Here, after knight f5 check, king e8, knight takes c7 was played, king takes c7, check, f6, and bishop f4. And white has a huge initiative here, threatening bishop takes d6, followed by queen h8 check. So black is forced to go rook takes b2, trying to get counterplay, knight a4 check. The king goes back to b1. If king a1, this would allow the queen to come in to c3 with check, and then most likely mate. So king b1, knight c3, king a1, knight takes d1, and then the player's repeated moves after queen h7 check, queen g8, king went back to e7, queen h7, and a draw was soon agreed. If black tries to play on here with a move like king to c7, the problem is white can exchange queens, and now either king takes c8 or bishop takes c8, white will play bishop takes d1. And in this situation with two bishops equal material, white actually has a pretty serious advantage with the h-pawn potentially just running up the board. Instead, in the game after king to e7, if white tries to go for the same endgame, his advantage is not nearly as big, as here the king is much closer to the h-pawn. The knight will come to e5, and basically black should be all right here. So overall, a really interesting game between the two players, and like I mentioned, it often happens that these super sharp and theoretical Najdorf lines, they tend to peter out into a draw, as both players are either so well prepared that they've studied the lines endlessly and they know exactly how the computer makes a draw, or during the game things are so complicated that it's really hard to take a lot of risk, and you always want to keep that perpetual in your pocket. Moving on to the final game between Grischuk and Ding Liren. This game, as Grischuk mentioned after the round, Was not a very exciting one, but was a pretty high quality game. Here we have an anti-martial system with this move h3. Black played bishop b7, d3, and now d5. This has been the main way Black has often been treating this position over the last couple of years, trying to sacrifice the pawn on e5 in martial gambit style anyway. Here after knight takes e5, Black can choose between trading and going queen to d6, followed by a quick rook a8 with some activity, or even more interesting move, knight to d4, where a full set of pieces on the board and Black is considered to have decent compensation for the pawn. Instead, White chooses a little bit slower move, knight bd2, just trying to play the structure, and the players followed some mainline theory here, a lot of correspondence games in this line. Knight a5, bishop a2, c5, bishop e3, rook f c8, takes, and now White plays knight takes c5, rook takes c5, and b4, winning back the piece as the knight on d5 is pinned to the king. B takes a5, king h8, bishop d2. I believe here Ding admitted that he was out of book and started to think on his own, although there was still theory at this point, again with the correspondence games, but he was actually able to find a pretty clean route to equality. Knight b4, bishop b3, bishop d5, takes, and finally the first new move of the game, rook to c1, preparing this break with c4. Knight c6 was played, c4, takes, knight takes a5, rook takes a c8, rook c8, d4, another strong move, taking advantage of the fact that the bishop on e7 is hanging. Then after knight c6, takes, we reach the situation where White has a very marginal advantage here, as this e5 pawn is an isolated pawn and a potential weakness, but with such reduced material and with Black having no other weaknesses and being able to just defend this pawn with a very solid move like bishop f6, White can definitely put a little bit of pressure here, but ultimately Grischuk, not through lack of trying, just wasn't able to really create a lot of problems, and on move 54 the players finally agreed to a draw. Then after the game, Grischuk did say some somewhat controversial stuff about how he felt like the tournament should not continue, it should be postponed. The environment is hostile and toxic, with everyone wearing masks and the corona panic going on. I think he definitely has a point. This is clearly a very unusual situation. Currently the Candidates tournament, as many people have pointed out, is basically the only major sporting event currently going on in the world, which is pretty crazy. Everything else has virtually been canceled. This kind of suggests that maybe this tournament was not supposed to be run at this point. Maybe it would have been better to postpone it. Grischuk apparently thinks that they should just stop the tournament right now and continue it later. And honestly, I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, a lot of chess fans are watching this tournament and really enjoying it, but I can imagine from the players' point of view, in addition to this being one of the most important events of their lives, they're obviously very concerned about what's going on in the world. I'm sure everyone has family and friends that they're worried about, and yeah, I'm sure it's a tough time to be focusing on the game. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Should they cancel the tournament? Should they postpone it? Should they send everyone home and just play stuff out online? I'm not sure exactly what the right solution is. Maybe they should have just postponed it right from the front. Clearly this is going to be a tournament that ends up making chess history, as the winner is probably going to be the player who's able to just deal and cope with the stress and pressure of playing in this environment right now. Alright guys, we'll be wrapping it up for today's video. Tomorrow we'll be doing the round 6 recap, and thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.